zoning is originally developed and spread as much as a tool of class segregation as of racial segregation. So it is a way to keep particularly immigrants, but poorer people out of wealthier neighborhoods, apartments out of single family neighborhoods. And that idea comes from Berkeley.
Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, How the Privileged and Propertied Broke America with Yoni Applebaum. Tonight we'll dive into whether America has ceased to be the land of opportunity and the role of property ownership and house building, or lack of it, have played in the diminishing belief in the American dream. And if this is the problem, what are our options for turning it around? I'm Stephen Saum. I'm Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California, and I'll be your host here this evening. Before we begin, a quick reminder to please silence your cell phones to avoid any disruptions. We also welcome your questions, and we'll incorporate as many as we can throughout. So please, if you're in the room with us, you have the question cards, submit questions via those. And if you're joining us online, please type them into the live chat. Now, Yoni Applebaum is Deputy Executive Editor at The Atlantic and author of the new book, Stuck: How the Privileged and Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Applebaum is a social and cultural historian of the United States. Before joining The Atlantic, he was a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University. He previously taught at Babson College and Brandeis University, where he received his PhD in American history. And he's moved a few times in his life, right? So please join me in welcoming Yoni Applebaum. Congratulations on this new book, and which also provides the cover story for the new edition of The Atlantic. I think an interesting place to start is maybe big picture, defining as you have the place of moving and the place of mobility in American identity and economic opportunity.
Yeah, so thank you all for coming tonight. This was, for me, the biggest surprise as I delved into the research for this book, was to recover just how central moving from one place to another had been to Americans' sense of themselves, to the things that they treasured about their country, how much they'd done it. At the peak, 1 out of 3 Americans was moving every year. It's sort of an astonishing number, like when you step back and think what that means in practical terms. We just got new numbers from the census in December. It's down to 1 out of 13. So there's been a precipitous fall over the last 50 years in American mobility. And when Americans were moving, right, and this was something they invented in the world. In most times and places, you inherited your place in the world. And I mean that both metaphorically, right? Your occupation, your spot in the social hierarchy, your religion, these were heritable characteristics. But also, I mean that literally, right? You inherited a spot in the world to which you were attached, generally by law. In most European nations, you didn't have the right to leave the town or community in which you were born. You were tied to it by various legal restrictions. And actual physical mobility was a privilege of the elite. In the United States, starting in the colonial period, Americans sort of crack this open. They do it inadvertently. The people who come over to this country intend to replace the kinds of social hierarchies that existed in Europe with themselves right at the top, right, the leaders of the colonies. But by relocating to the U.S., they are cracking open the possibilities of mobility. And that genie is just not possible to stuff back into the bottle. By about 1800, Americans have codified a new set of rights. Residence is no longer dependent on the community accepting you, which it was through most of the colonial period. You could show up someplace and be warned out, even if you'd bought a house or rented a farm or gotten engaged to a girl in town. The town could say, we don't want you here, and warn you out. You had no right to live where you wanted. You needed the acceptance of a community to establish residence. But Americans invent this new right. They say, no, residence is going to be a matter of intent. If you intend to come here and to live here and to make it your home, that will be enough under the law. And that's what really widens this remarkable possibility of mobility for Americans. And what that does in turn is it gives Americans this amazing sense of agency. When they relocate from one place to another, they can redefine their entire lives, right? You're no longer trapped by the past that you inherited, by the identities that have been passed down to you. When you go to that new town, you can try out the new church down the road. For more than 200 years, America has been the only country on earth where a majority of adults don't belong to the confession or religion into which they were born. That's been a consistent characteristic from the founding. You could redefine your occupation, right? And often you would, because you'd land someplace new and there'd be new kinds of jobs available to you. You could climb the social hierarchy. We can compare Americans in almost any decade to their European counterparts, and you find that they move more often over longer distances and to greater effect. They're more likely to move up in occupational brackets and income. The kids are likely to do much better than the parents. This is, when we talk about the American dream, this is what we're talking about. That ability to define your own identity. And we don't do it atomistically either. As we move, we create really vibrant social communities. So all of these things come out of this historic American mobility, which is why when I tell you that our mobility has fallen from 1 in 3 moving every year to 1 in 13, it makes me really worried about this country.
So one of the things that comes along with that restlessness and that moving that you write about is the role of associations. I mean, you talk about churches and choosing your confession, but it's far more than that. I mean, it's the sense of how you integrate into the communities that you're moving into.
Yeah, and this too was surprising to me in that when we talk about America, we're often an individualistic people, right? American individualism means something very particular. It doesn't mean that we were atomistic. It's not that all Americans lived hermetic existences closed off from their fellows. No, when Europeans come over here in the 19th century and they write travelogues, which was a very popular thing to do, it's a good way to finance your American vacation. You could sort of gawk at the Americans and their strange ways and customs. And the two things that every European visitor notices: first, they notice our mobility. It is incredibly disquieting to them. They don't like it at all. They're like, they understand that desperate people move. That was something that happened in Europe too. What they don't get is why somebody could have a perfectly good farm in America and decide to move over to the next state in search of a better farm. Like, just be happy with your lot in life, accept your assigned place. Why are you always striving? Tocqueville said we're always restless in the midst of prosperity. It really bothered him. He said, there's something about these people that they don't know their assigned place, right? They're always trying to rise above their station. That's one thing they all notice. The other thing they all notice is that we have the most vibrant civic life they've ever seen, and they wish that they could have it too. They notice our mania for associations, all of the voluntary organizations that we're constantly creating, how full our churches are on Sunday, right? Like, that's very surprising to them because although American religion was largely volitional, it was also, in fact, not although, because American religion was largely volitional, it was also much more vibrant, right? We have waves of religious revival that sweep over the country. When you can choose your own church, you commit to it in a different kind of way. And that was true of every aspect of civic and organizational life. When you're joining the Knights of Pythias or the Independent Order of Oddfellows or the Masons, groups that maybe these names don't even mean anything anymore, but they were huge in the 19th century. And they gave you a way to belong and to find status and fellowship. They gave you the kinds of community that you needed to sustain yourself when you moved far away from your parents, from your cousins, from the world that you'd known as a child. And so our civic life comes out of our mobility. It's because we're moving so constantly that because it's really uncomfortable, actually. If you move into a new community, it's uncomfortable, or if you're living in a current community, to walk into a new organization for the first time where everybody knows everybody else and you're the odd one out. It's uncomfortable to sit down at the bar and start talking to the guy next to you, right? If you are staying in place, you are less likely to push yourself into that uncomfortable spot. When you move, you don't have a choice. You've got to introduce yourself to your neighbors. You've got to find somebody to interact with. And so it is the mobility that forces Americans out of their comfort zones to reach out to their fellows, to join organizations, and to create this extraordinary flourishing of civic life.
So I should note, you mentioned the Masons. My grandfather was Grand Master of the Masons of Nebraska, so that's one I do know. But Nebraska, of course, kind of figures into that, the westward movement of a lot of European Americans. But the frontier and the westward movement is not the whole of moving when you're talking about. There's a dynamism everywhere that you write about.
Yeah, and this was surprising to Americans as they started to discover it. It shouldn't surprise us, right? Most people are not living out on the frontier. The vast majority of the American population is always resident first along the eastern seaboard and then the industrial heartland of the Midwest. It's not out there on the frontier. And so most moves are not taking place on the frontier. That image you may have gotten in grade school of Americans making that march of westward progress in the Conestoga wagons and going out and staking homes, that was real. That happened. But the rates of mobility back east were, if anything, even higher. We can now go and track the census records. For a long time, historians knew about these moves, and they thought here was evidence of American failure. Because they could look at a city and see that lots of people came to the city, and within a few years, many of those people had left the city. You can look at one decade in Boston's growth, for example. It goes from something like 300 to 360,000 in population, but over the course of that decade, 800,000 people are going to move into the city and move back out. Right? There's just extraordinary churn in the population. And for a long time, we assumed that was because it was really hard to make it in the US. Then we were able to use digitization to link the census records and watch what happened to those people when they left. The people who left did even better than the people who stayed. And that is consistently the story of America, that the leavers do better than the stayers, that the people who exercise their freedom of mobility and go someplace new and chase opportunity, they do better, and then the effect is actually amplified in the second generation. Their kids do even better than the kids of the people who had stayed. And so mobility is not just out, pushing the western frontier. There's this institution called Moving Day in most eastern and midwestern, many southern cities, when all leases would expire on the same day. They were all unwritten. And a quarter, a third, half of the population of a city would pick up and swap apartments between sunup and sundown. You cannot imagine the chaos, right? You'd pile your belongings by the curb in the morning, and you try to flag down a cartman who charges you some inflated rate to pile everything you own in the back of the car and to go across the rutted street where, things are bouncing out the back and the legs of your furniture maybe are getting all scratched up. And then you got to load it into the new house as the other family is exiting. But people looked at their homes in these years the way I might today look at an iPhone, or I might look at a car, right? I want it for a couple of years, it's useful. But then I can move up, I can get something better. My apartment has running water, but the next one might have hot and cold running water. And in a couple of years, maybe they've invented gas heat, and I can get heat right there in my apartment, running through the pipes, right? And that kind of technological innovation, it's not that homes today don't have technological innovation, right? We still do this, but people tend to be resident for much longer periods of time, and you tend to live with whatever technology you acquired when you got your house. But that was not how they thought of it. They sort of thought, every year or two I can do better, I can move up. And the magic of it was they almost all could, as long as you're expanding the housing supply in a city and building a relatively small number of luxury units for the rich. And the rich are mobile, they're moving up into those luxury units. And then the people who are a little less rich move up into their apartments. And the upper middle classes move up into their apartments. And on an annual or biennial basis, pretty much everybody in the city can move into a place nicer than the one they'd had just a year or two before. You can trace this through the property records, 10, 12, 15 moves in a chain, from the person who moves into that brand new luxury unit down to the person who moves from a really bad tenement to a slightly better one. And then you can watch them do it again in another couple of years. So this was how mobility functioned in American cities. You had this amazing ritual of Moving Day when a third, half the city would swap apartments, and almost everybody would end up better off for it.
So we've been talking about the moving,
Yeah.
and kind of talking about the dynamism. So let's talk about some of the things that kind of began to turn it in another direction. Maybe let's start with one of the cities in California that you talk about, Modesto.
Yeah, I ended up writing a book that was much more about California than I'd realized, because California is this remarkable place, right? It fills up overnight. The city we are in goes to sleep, one night, 1,000 people, sleepy fishing town, and wakes up the next year and it's like a city of 25,000, right? No American place had ever grown that fast. And it's got all kinds of discontents too. Most of the people who come out here in the early years are men. None of them want to do the laundry. It's women's work. They literally, they're walking around with filthy clothes rather than wash them. It gets so bad in classic Bay Area fashion. A entrepreneur comes up with a clever new startup. He charters boats that are going to Hawaii. He'll take your laundry from you in a bag, put it on the boat to Hawaii, and 6 weeks later you can get a clean shirt back. Uber for clothes or something, right? So this is the state of affairs. There are many Chinese immigrants here who are first chased off the railroads and out of the gold mines. They face tremendous discrimination. But they find a niche, right? Like, they can do laundry. They are willing to do the laundry in order to have their piece of the American dream. And it is work that white people are not contesting for. And so they move into the laundry trade. That becomes the signature business of the Chinese in the 19th century. They face tremendous discrimination. And in Modesto, where they have set up these laundry shops, the elite whites in Modesto don't like the fact they're there at all. The middle class whites, the ones who don't have servants to do their laundry for them, they're kind of happy about it. But the elites try to drive them out. The first thing that they turn to is vigilante violence. They don hoods, they go marching through Chinatown, smashing windows, beating people in the streets. And the Chinese rebuild because it's their city too. And then they try arson. They try burning down some of the laundries to scare them away. And the Chinese rebuild again because it's still their city. And then they hit on something which is more devastating than the vigilante violence, and it is more devastating than the arson. They write America's first zoning ordinance. This is the first time in American legal history where somebody writes a law which says there's something which is perfectly fine to do over here. It's not hurting anyone, it's not a bad thing, but you can't do it over there. They say you need to move all of the laundries west of the tracks and south of G Street. The problem was that a laundry is like a coffee shop, right? Like, you don't walk past 3 laundries to get to the 4th one to drop your clothes in the morning. You go to the one that's in your neighborhood. And so the Chinese launderers were moving into white neighborhoods in order to be close to their customers. Made the laundries happy, made the customers happy, did not make the elites who are governing Modesto happy. This ordinance, if you look at a map, I pulled a map of Modesto from 1885, the year they write this ordinance. It's written in arid language. It doesn't say anything about the Chinese. It's about laundries, and it's about a specific geographic spot. There's only one block on that map that is west of the tracks and south of G Street, and it is labeled Chinatown. So this is an explicit ghettoization ordinance. It's pushing all of the Chinese in Modesto back into Chinatown. But it does so without mentioning race once. And when it goes up to the California Supreme Court, it is upheld. The justices know perfectly well what the ordinance is designed to do, but they find that because it's facially neutral, you can do it. And this is where zoning in America starts.
And it's different, as you noted, say from like in San Francisco where you want slaughterhouses confined to a certain area because of the stench and the threat of disease.
Yeah, we'd always had land use law, right? The basic principle of land use law was you can regulate nuisances, right? So if somebody's using the land in a way that hurts somebody next to them, then you can regulate that, and that's only fair. This is firmly enshrined in the common law. There was something, cities had this thing called the police power, which was the power to regulate for the health, safety, or welfare of the inhabitants. But the laundries weren't hurting the health, safety, or welfare of the inhabitants. They weren't actually a public nuisance. The courts repeatedly rule that they're just a utility, basically. They're just an honest way to earn a living. And so you couldn't regulate them under the police power until Modesto does. And so zoning is the regulation of things that are not hurting anyone, and the splitting of them between some geographic areas so that they're confined to some areas and not to others.
All right, so we're sitting here in San Francisco. One of the other places that gets featured in the book is right across the bay in Berkeley, and the role of zoning laws there.
This was the advent of single-family zoning, right? So the early zoners were mostly lawyers, and they knew better than to try it. The reason that Modesto writes the first zoning law, San Francisco had explored this because it's a clever idea, push all the Chinese back into Chinatown. They went to the city solicitor and he said, don't even try it. Like, there was no way the courts are going to uphold this. So they don't go for it, but Modesto does. You get something similar in Berkeley. There's an architect out there who is really upset His name is Charles Cheney. He works at an architecture practice here in San Francisco in a 9-story building. So he's got nothing against cities. He's got nothing against buildings. He has something against working class people. He wants Berkeley to be a leafy, bucolic suburb that he can retreat to at the end of the day by getting on the ferry and crossing the bay. He does not want it to be invaded by the kinds of apartment buildings and working class residents that he has to put up with while he's working in San Francisco during the daytime. And somebody has just built an apartment building right down the block from him. And he's mad about this, but there's nothing he can do. So he forms or takes part in a state-level commission to examine the problem of apartment buildings and immigrants in California. Then recommends a new state-level law to allow cities to regulate the housing in cities. Drafts the first local municipal ordinance under that law for Berkeley. Gets appointed the secretary of the commission that will implement the law, and writes the first single-family zoning rule in America. It is for his block. He says, there will be no more apartment buildings in my little neighborhood of Elmwood, I'm going to protect it. And it gets ratified. And it is explicitly an implement of class segmentation, right? This was a surprise to me. Although you can find zoning sometimes being used, as it was in Modesto, as a tool of racial segregation, American discrimination is so strong in the late 19th and early 20th century that you don't generally need zoning to do that. Zoning is originally developed and spread as much as a tool of class segregation as of racial segregation. So it is a way to keep particularly immigrants, but poorer people out of wealthier neighborhoods, apartments out of single-family neighborhoods. And that idea comes from Berkeley. What they're trying to do is to prevent, they're quite clear about this, they don't want California to look like the East. They look at Manhattan and they say, not like that, right? Not crowded districts full of apartment buildings stuffed with immigrants. We're going to have a workers' paradise out here in California, and we're going to do it with single-family homes.
So the East, I think, it makes exact sense to take the conversation there and the role of tenements and reformers who have something against tenements and how that shifts the dynamic and mobility.
Tenements are amazing, right? When you look back at the populations that lived in tenements in the early 20th century, at the time, people who wrote about tenements described them as festering hellholes that were going to trap their residents in endemic intergenerational poverty. They actually went quite a bit further than that. They wrote in evolutionary terms that because they'd kill off anyone who had proper morals, you would get degenerate populations living in the tenements within 2 or 3 generations. That the tenements, just by living in an apartment, it would be morally corrupting. You'd fall prey to vice, to sexual licentiousness. I mean, they blame everything but jazz. At least I haven't found a source yet that blames jazz on tenements. But everything else was blamed on the physical form of these apartment buildings. But when you think about those populations, right, you can't look at the Italian Americans, the Irish Americans, the Jewish immigrants who were living in these tenements in these years and say, gosh, they really got trapped in intergenerational poverty, right? These were actually machines of upward economic mobility, which were often caricatured by the reformers who did not like the immigrant populations that they housed. But when we get broader studies of the tenements, they repeatedly find that conditions in most tenements were fine, that the reformers had cherry-picked a handful of extreme examples in the photographic work of people like Jacob Riis or the work of the Tenement Commission. There is this guy, Jacob Wheeler, Lawrence Wheeler, Jacob's brother. So Lawrence Wheeler is like Mr. Tenement Reform. He is the guy who issues all the reports and writes all the laws and then enforces them in New York. And there's this amazing moment. Sometimes when you're doing archival research, you come across something and you just can't believe that it's there in writing. Yeah. He's at this conference and somebody says, how do we keep apartments out of our city? And he says, well, you've got a problem there because apartments are popular. So you can't do it democratically. You can't just put it to a vote because people are going to vote for apartments. But there is a way you can do it. I've got like 2 words for you: fire safety. What you do is you layer on lots of tough regulations on top of the apartments that drives the cost of the apartment up above where it's economically feasible to build them. But, he says, there's a warning I have to give you. Be careful not to put any fire safety rules on 1 or 2 family homes. You'll price them out too, right? So he's like, yeah, it's not actually about fire safety, but this is how you do it, right? Like, the courts have agreed that you can regulate fire safety as a city, so you just layer on fire safety regulations until the thing is priced out, and then you can't build any more tenements in the city. And that's exactly what he does. He passes the new law tenements in New York, and he drives the cost of new tenement construction way up, and this is explicitly a means of immigration restriction in New York and a way to keep working class homes out of more affluent neighborhoods and stop the spread of tenements.
So one of the other really fascinating dimensions to the book is when you talk about transformation that comes along later in the 20th century and the role of one woman in particular, who has been seen as a hero for many decades, maybe to those who care about their communities and don't want them destroyed by new development, but is part of the problem.
You're talking about Jane Jacobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a warning. Don't research your heroes. You may not like what you will find. Jane Jacobs is the patron saint of modern urbanism. She is living in New York and moves into a home on Hudson Street in the 1940s, and she gets everything right. At a moment when the reformers want to come through and knock down whole neighborhoods in the name of urban renewal and slum clearance, she says, no, you misunderstand everything about cities, everything that you hate about cities, the mix of uses, the population jostling against each other on the streets, the way that there are stores underneath apartments, all of that, diversity of use, diversity of population, that's the good stuff. That's what you actually want to preserve in a city. That's what makes a city worth living in. And she writes this brilliant book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she lays this all out. And then when Robert Moses, the great building czar of New York, tries to level the West Village, she and her neighbors stand up and they yell, stop. And really, for the first time, they stop an urban renewal scheme in its tracks and save the West Village. All of this, by the way, was terrific. But Jacobs didn't write honestly about what she'd done with her own home. She buys a mixed-use building, which had been previously inhabited by an immigrant family where they live upstairs and they've got 2 kids. They operate a candy store on the ground floor. It's exactly the kind of use that she praises. They're operating this candy store. They're selling single cigarettes to passersby. You could do that. It was considered good back then. And newspapers but it was the kind of store where, like, if you were running out, you could leave the key there for your kid when they came home from school. It was a neighborhood institution. But when she buys the building, she rips out the ground level retail, turns it into a single family home, strips off the historic facade so that when she later landmarks it, it's found to have no historic value, and presents a blank front to the street, and then praises the 2 shops on either side of her. But that was kind of typical of a lot of the urban reformers of the mid-20th century. They liked a lot of what they saw, but they didn't like change. Jacobs was correct in her diagnosis of the problems facing these neighborhoods, but her solution was to empower the residents of neighborhoods to control their own communities. Remember at the beginning where I talked about how a community could decide whether or not it was going to have you as a member? That was the thing that America cracked open to enable our extraordinary mobility. And what Jacobs and her fellow reformers did was they re-erected those walls around communities. They said, no, local communities should be back in charge of who they're going to admit as members. We're not going to do it person by person anymore, but we'll do it building by building. We'll decide what kinds of things can be collectively. We'll decide. Except that Jacobs herself kind of hated democracy. She was extremely suspicious of politicians and elections. Her preferred method for doing this wasn't to say, well, okay, the whole local community will take a vote. Which actually they tried here in California in 1952. There were sometimes proposals to do exactly this, to say if somebody wants to move in, maybe we can have a law which will just allow us to vote them out. She had a different solution. She said, well, we'll set up a set of hearings where you have to get communal input. We'll set up review processes where people can come and testify. And we'll give a right to sue to anyone who doesn't like the way the decision is being made. In practice, what this does is it means that it's not all the people of a neighborhood who are deciding. It's certainly not the people who would like to move into the neighborhood. They have no voice in this process. It's anyone with enough time and money and anger to gum up a project long enough to make the project unaffordable to construct. I just saw this afternoon that the West Village, in the last 12 months, New York releases annual statistics. It's actually had negative housing creation. There are fewer housing units in the West Village now than there were a year ago. That is what has happened to the West Village. The house that she bought for $7,000 now sells for $6 million. And this is the other legacy of Jane Jacobs. So she stopped the leveling of the West Village, which was great, but she also froze it. I mean, I walk down the West Village now, it's like walking into a taxidermist shop. Everything is frozen in a lifelike pose, but the things that attracted her to that neighborhood, the vibrant population, the mix of immigrant groups, none of that's there, right? It's a simulacrum of the city where many of the people who live there are not resident year-round. The prices have gone well beyond the reach of the diverse mix of population that was once there. There's no longer a diverse use of spaces. They converted her ground floor back into retail. It's a high-end real estate agent now, which is like, it's one of those little poetic touches where you're sort of writing your thing, no, yeah, I can throw that in there.
So how do we get from that moment to the most recent census report, right, where it's only 1 out of 13 people are moving? I mean,
yeah. Even with zoning does not stop American mobility. As late as 1970, 1 out of 5 Americans is moving every year. And since then, it's been a steady 50-year slide. It may even be accelerating a little bit. So what really kills it is this legal revolution that Jane Jacobs is at the forefront of, which gives local communities, again, the power to restrict who can move in. Once you've done that, once you've vested that authority in local communities, it becomes almost impossible to build. And it's a particular tragedy because it becomes hardest to build in the most progressive communities. There's a great study of California which finds that for every additional 10 points in Democratic vote share a city has, the number of housing permits it issues drops 30%. So it's not even like more the Democratic ones than it's like as it gets more Democratic, it gets harder and harder to build. And there are good reasons for this, right? Democrats, progressives, are the ones who believe in the power of government to achieve good. They believe in using government to pursue public goods, right? So protecting the environment, preserving the historic character of a community, staving off gentrification. There are many very good reasons to be worried about new development. But in aggregate, it's had tremendously perverse effects to the point where today, I know Americans want to live in progressive jurisdictions because the housing prices are so damn high, right? Like you can see the implied demand that reveals. I also know that they are moving away from progressive jurisdictions in large numbers because they can no longer afford to live there. It is something that has cost the Democratic Party both congressional seats and electoral votes in recent years. And there's a flip side to this too, right? We often think about the problems of the people who live in a city like San Francisco. And maybe all of you were lucky enough to inherit property here and are happily housed. You may not know that it is difficult to rent or afford a place in the city of San Francisco today. But I'm told that this is true. But there's also another side to the coin here, right? Which is all the people living in the parts of the country which are not like San Francisco. 50 years ago, if you were a janitor in Alabama and you moved to San Francisco, your income would go way up. Just having the same job, right? Janitors earned a lot more here than they did in rural Alabama. You'd pay more in cost of living, but you'd still end up way ahead. Today, if that same guy moves to San Francisco for the same job, he'll still earn, the wage premium is, if anything, even higher today. But the housing costs will more than erase the gains. He will end up worse off than if he'd never left Alabama. And so the odds are he's never left Alabama. All across the country, there are people who have remained where they were born or very close to where they were born because they lost the freedom to move toward opportunity. The places in America that are creating jobs, that are creating opportunities, the places in America where when we map it, we can see that the kids do better than their parents did, those places have become prohibitively expensive. They're preponderantly progressive jurisdictions. They've enacted rules that make it impossible to build housing, and people can't get in. And it's unseen damage for the most part, right? You've never met that guy from Alabama who didn't move here to San Francisco. You're not aware that he existed, and he certainly didn't come and testify when there was a hearing about whether or not to put up a new apartment building. But because that building wasn't built and others like it, his life stagnated. And we know something, there's a really cool study done by some University of Chicago psychologists about people who wanted to move and sort of how their lives turned out, right? They went around, they asked a bunch of people, because one question I often get is like, well, maybe people who want to move are just like different than the people who don't want to move, and that'd be fine. But we can look just at the people who say they want to move, right? So they got a sample of people who said, I intend to move in the next year. Then they followed up a year later to see whether or not they'd actually been able to follow through on it. And the fascinating thing is the ones who moved changed. If you moved, you became more optimistic, more future-oriented in your planning. You were likelier to reach out and make new friends, to join new organizations. And you started to see the gains of your community as reinforcing your own gains and vice versa. You felt like you were all rising together. But something really bad happened to the people who said they wanted to move and couldn't. And the number of Americans who say that is up 45% over that same 50-year span, right? So this is a growing problem. The people who wanted to move and couldn't, they ended up more cynical, more alienated, more detached, and more inclined to see the world as a zero-sum game, where anyone else's gains were coming at their own expense. And so this is the other downside of a lack of mobility. If you've looked around the country and you map the places where mobility is down the most, if it's the blue jurisdictions which mostly have fenced themselves off, it's the red jurisdictions that have lost their mobility. And people there are not wrong that they are getting screwed out of the American dream. They are not wrong to be angry and resentful about that. They may not be able to tell you the thing I'm upset about is that I couldn't move, because nobody ever wants to move. But I can tell you that historically, when we have opened up the possibility of mobility, Americans have jumped at it. And today, they say they want to do it in large numbers, and they no longer are doing it. And that gap, that growing gap between the Americans who would like to relocate toward opportunity and the ones who actually can, is, I think, one of the biggest problems in the US today.
You actually mentioned a study that you helped with the research on connected to the 2016 election and how that.
Yeah, in the 2016 election, Americans who had never left their hometown were 30 points more likely to vote for Donald Trump than those who had. It's a really big gap, and it's one of the strongest correlates that you're going to find, even adjusting for other factors.
So, and there's also, and you talk some about this, years ago we had When Bowling Alone came out, Robert Putnam spoke here, right? That downswing in terms of civic participation correlates with the decline of mobility as well.
Yeah, just the way at the beginning I talked about how mobility got us out of our comfort zones and got us to join clubs and organizations. Well, we're not moving anymore, and we're not joining clubs and organizations anymore. You can look at a club over time, and what you'll usually find is that the clubs have a steady rate of attrition. So they may lose, say, 7% of their members every year. What distinguishes a healthy organization from one that is dying is not actually who's leaving. It's usually how many new members are exceeding. And the people who come into clubs tend to be new arrivals, right? They're at that fluid stage of their lives where they're looking for new ways to get out there, to bond with other people. And so in a community which is a constant infusion of new arrivals, you find a really healthy civic life. Where you choke off that flow of new arrivals, that steady rate of attrition will start to outstrip the rate of accession, and the clubs will decline. And that's what's happened all across the country as these clubs and organizations are dying. There's one other thing I'll throw out there. There was a book, another book we can throw in here, called The Big Sort a while back, which posited that mobility is sort of the social asset, and we're moving to different places and polarizing the country. The problem with this thesis is that the 50 years of increased polarization are also the 50 years of sharply declining mobility. So it's really hard for me to understand how that would be the cause. But we have other political science research which says something really different is going on. When you live in a community and new people move in, they bring with them different perspectives, different life experiences, maybe different political affiliations. If you have a constant flow of new people, you're mixing together people of varied backgrounds and beliefs. Where that flow chokes off, we are social creatures. most of us will naturally incline to adopt the views of those around us. And you can find this actually in the longitudinal studies, which say, look, we're going to look over time what's happening in this community. People will tend toward conformity. Not all of them. There's like one guy in every community who does exactly the opposite of what everyone else is doing. But on the whole, most of us are conformist creatures. And if we're no longer moving around, if we're no longer mixing, our communities will polarize because of that lack of mixing. And so it's not just that it's attenuating the civic health of our communities. It's not just that we have this difference between the people who are optimistic because they have that sense of agency in their lives and the people who grow pessimistic because they don't. It's that this is actually a key driver of political polarization in the U.S.
So I know you mentioned in at least one interview you've had some uncomfortable conversations with friends connected to this book.
Yeah, not everybody likes this book. I am, for one thing, I'm saying that many progressives have produced exactly the opposite of the outcomes they thought they were trying to produce. That we've created a society that has grown more unequal, we passed a bunch of laws intended to choke off sprawl, and they have resulted in a system that makes it impossible to build in center cities and has driven enormous amounts of sprawl. So this is one thing that I'm asking people to look at, to measure their acts not by the intent, which is often noble, but by the outcome. And to ask themselves whether or not the country is better off after 50 years of progressive change in this direction. And I'm also, I often find that people are pretty uncomfortable with the idea of building on their block, right? That if you say to somebody, do you want an apartment building to go next to you? Well, I don't want an apartment to go next to me. I live in a single family home. I love it. If you ask me about that apartment building, I start imagining the construction noise, the dust, fighting for parking, late night noise, right? I can imagine all of the bad outcomes that come with that building. And in fact, if you poll Americans, that's exactly what they'll tell you. But I also know that you can poll them on a different set of questions. So if instead of asking about the building or the new construction, if you say, do you want to live in a community that has room for young families? Is diversity one of your values? And do you want to live in a diverse community? Do you think that the nurses and the daycare workers and the firefighters who serve this community should be able to raise their own children in this community? Then you're off to a whole different conversation. We're not even talking about the janitor in Alabama yet, right? But once you make it about the people, once you make it about the kind of culture you want to live in, the kind of values you want to champion, all of a sudden people can see past the construction noise or the fight over parking to the larger picture. And that, I think, is really the project of the book, is to get us to take a step back and say, okay, all of these rules seemed reasonable to the people who put them into place at the time. But what if we took a step back and we looked at the aggregate impact and asked ourselves whether or not they produced a society that we think is functioning very, very smoothly and we're very happy with. And when I go around the country and talk about this book, I meet remarkably few people who feel that way about the contemporary United States. And then what I want people to ask themselves is, would allowing somebody to build that apartment building on my block, would it be worth it if it moved us back in that other direction?
So speaking of your block, you mentioned a couple of signs that you see out your window in Washington, D.C., connected specifically to diversity and welcoming. And
yeah, you've ever seen one of these signs like 3 languages and it says all are welcome here, we love our neighbors. And then next to it on the line will be one which says vote no on 3 or, stop gentrification, no new housing. And I'm just saying how do you love all your neighbors and you're that angry about getting new neighbors? There's just, right there, you get the 2 contradictory impulses of contemporary progressivism, both of which are grounded in sets of progressive values, both of which seem non-contradictory to the people who are putting the signs on their lawn. But when you look closely at it, I don't know any way to reconcile those 2 sentiments. If you really want to welcome everybody, if you're saying all are welcome here, then you have to welcome them.
So one of the members of the audience wants to know, has gentrification always been a consequence of mobility? And how can we balance mobility, choice, and displacement?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So the answer is that neighborhood succession has always been an outgrowth of mobility, right? Neighborhoods change over time. I went back, to the Lower East Side where my great-grandfather lived in a tenement. And after it was a Jewish neighborhood, it was an Italian neighborhood and a Chinese neighborhood. It has succeeded again, and I don't think I could rent his apartment. That tenement that was going to be morally degrading now rents for $7,200 a month. So gentrification is not unique to San Francisco. I think that the pain of gentrification is particularly acute if people are losing something they have no chance of ever getting back, right? So when housing was something where most people expected that through their serial relocations they do better and better, you didn't get a discourse of gentrification, right? It happened. You'd get neighborhood succession. A neighborhood might upgrade, it might downgrade, but you didn't get the same angst about it that you tend to get today, because most of the people who are leaving believed that they were leaving for something they wanted even more. They had a sense of agency in the process. It's a little bit like a game of musical chairs. If you've got, a set number of chairs out there, and a bunch of rich people come in and grab the best chairs, and then there's no good place for you to sit, you're going to be justifiably angry about that. If you've got a bunch of chairs out there and a bunch of developers come in and set up an extra 20 chairs, and now there's more than enough places for everyone to sit, you don't have the same anger, even if you're not sitting down in the same place you had, right? Like even if you're no longer living in the same place. So this is actually, I think, where a lot of the anger over gentrification justifiably comes from, right? Is the very real and accurate sense that people have that as the neighborhood around them is changing, they'll never find anything like it again. That those changes won't benefit them. That they either they'll be displaced because the rents will come too high, or maybe they hang on, but all the retail around them changes, and there's no longer stores that serve people like them. They lose their friends who they bonded with over the decades, and as they age in place, there's no longer a supportive community for them. Like these are real concerns, but they are driven in part by the lack of agency of a constricted housing market. And in a housing market where you actually have enough places for everyone to live, people tend to view this in a very different light.
So if we're talking about solutions, you have three principles that you put for them, and you kind of don't get down into the weeds and saying, here's exactly the legislation we need. So what are the principles that you would hope would guide a change in how we think about mobility?
Yeah, and I'm happy to get down to the weeds with anyone who wants, but at a very broad level, I think the first thing we need is consistency. The rules are just too damn complicated, and they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There are cities with literally, between like the basic zoning code and the overlay districts, hundreds of potential zoning designations. If you're building a house in the United States today, you're better off usually starting by hiring a lawyer than by hiring an architect. Like navigating these codes has gotten insanely complicated. And it's not just a problem for the people who are trying to build, it's a problem for the cost of housing too. Housing is one of the sectors which has shown almost no productivity gains over the last century, which is largely because of these rules. If you figure out a better way to build a house, I'll give you an example. Actually, I live in a house that was manufactured by the Sears company. You could order it out of a catalog, and it arrived in a couple of boxcars with like a giant, like a Lego kit, right? It had a giant instruction manual, and you just sort of put all the pieces together, and then you had a house. And Sears could do that 100 years ago, because there were almost no rules about housing. So they could ship that house anywhere in the country, and you could buy it and put it together, and then you'd have yourself a house. Mine was put together by a high school teacher. And that was pretty cool. If you tried that today, and there are modular housing companies that are trying that today, it doesn't work, right? Like you design a great house for the city that you're building in, and then you try to sell it to somebody in the next city over, and it doesn't conform with their codes. So now you're tweaking it, and pretty soon you've lost all of the efficiencies of scale. So one of the reasons that housing is so expensive is the rules are wildly inconsistent. So if you simplify the rules and allow people to build as of right, which is to say if they're following the rules, they can just put the thing up, you give predictability, you give the benefits of scale and the productivity gains that will drive down the cost of new construction and enable us to have a much more affordable housing stock. And I know that this works because you can see other countries pull it off. And so it's not some untested idea. The second basic principle here is tolerance. There used to be a lot of very different ways that you could live. The guy who writes the first zoning code in New York, Edward Murray Bassett, he lives over the course of his young adult life, and he sublets a room from somebody. where he just needs a place to live up in Albany. He lives in a bachelor hotel, which was a thing that they had, right? Where like young men in the city could just like rent a room. He lives in a boarding house. He lives in a townhouse with another family, so two families subdividing a space for one family. As he's climbing his way up and getting his law degree, reading actually in Grover Cleveland's office at night, he is living in a wide variety of housing types, all of which he will later ban, right? Like he's made it up the ladder and nobody else can do this. We used to give people a much wider array of options. Right now I'm living in a single family home. It is the right choice for this moment in my life. There will come a time when I can't make it up the stairs of that home and I will need something which is better accommodated to my needs as a senior citizen. Earlier in my life, I couldn't possibly have afforded it. At different stages of my life, in order to exercise mobility, I needed access to different housing types. For the most part, our building codes no longer allow these, the zoning codes no longer allow these, and I think we need to acknowledge that what works well for us might not be what works well for somebody else, and legalize. Not force anyone to live where they don't want, right? But just say, okay, if that's what's working for you, that's what we'll allow. California has done a very good job, like other states, of cracking down on substandard housing. The result is that it has 170,000 people living on the streets. Like this is what happens if you ban less than optimal housing arrangements. What you end up with is a homelessness crisis. In the 19th century, we did not do that, and we did not have a homelessness crisis. The two are intimately related. So that's the second thing, is tolerance. And the third is pretty simple, abundance. I think one of the tough things about talking about housing is I'm asking you not to believe your lying eyes. You watched a new luxury development go in, and they said it was necessary because we had a housing crisis, and then your rent went up. And you know that luxury development did not drive down your rent because your rent went up. That new luxury development was a teaspoon out of a bathtub full of need, right? Like if you are building just a little bit at a time, you are not going to solve this problem. We have a 50-year deficit to make up. Where we have not been constructing adequate supplies of housing in this country. Just at a very basic level, just to adequately house all Americans, we probably need another 4.5 million units. If you want to house those Americans in places where they'll have access to better jobs, where their kids will have better prospects in life, you're talking more like 20 million or 30 million units, depending on how you calculate that, which is a lot. But we build 1.5 million already in this country every year, right? So over a 10-year span, it would mean roughly doubling our rate of housing production, which is eminently doable, but it takes the political will to sort of pull back the rules far enough to allow for the builders to come in and meet that demand.
So that seems like a big ask when you talk those numbers, but you also talk about the opportunity cost of not doing that. I mean, you talk about a study that specifically that drills down on San Francisco and San Jose and New York.
Yeah, so it looks at sort of like what would our national GDP look like if everybody could relocate to the cities where they're more productive, right? Because we know this, that if you come to San Francisco, your productivity as a worker goes up. If you multiply that out and just look at the people who otherwise would have moved, right, and assume perfect elasticity, you're talking about ballpark $2 trillion a year, right? $9,000 more in the pocket of every American. That's a little high. There's all kinds of reasons that people don't move that have nothing to do with maximizing their productivity. But it gives you some sense of the scale of the loss that we've incurred. And it's not just like everybody always has to live in San Francisco or New York, or right. The history of the U.S. is a history of booms and busts. I can't predict where the good place to live in 10 years is going to be. If I could, instead of talking to you, I'd be like out there real estate investing. I know it won't be the same place that it is today because it never has been, right? And so it's not that everybody has to move to the same places, but if you give people the individual freedom to make those choices, in aggregate, they'll help produce the next boom. And that boom will enable really cool things. Part of what makes California special is until the 21st century, a majority of the native-born Americans in this state were not born in this state, right? That's true throughout the 19th century. It's true throughout the 20th century. It's only in very recent years that has ceased to be true. And it has ceased to be true because of a set of policy choices made around 1970 very purposefully by the California state legislature and a couple of governors who decided that California was full, that it had entered an era of limits, that it could no longer accommodate the population, and that the way to prevent more people from coming here was to stop building. Like, they were purposeful about this, and they were explicit about what they were doing, that there were too many people in California. They talked about other solutions, like what if you just capped the electricity supply in the state so that if somebody else moved in, they wouldn't have any electricity. But they hit on housing as sort of the most effective tool to do this. Up until 1970, the price of a median home in California was right in line with the national average. And that was true in decades when the population grew by 50%, right? So between like 1950 and 1960, the population grows by 50%. The housing stock grows by 50%. Like, you could do it. Once California stops building, which it does purposefully as a means of controlling the population and installing an era of limits, the housing price shoots up. It had been 2.5 times the median income. It is today more than 11 times the median income statewide. And so California made a very conscious choice. I think that a lot of California's sort of economic miracle of the last 50 years was an outgrowth of the number of people who came to the state from elsewhere to start new lives here, to pursue opportunity here. It still happens at the high end. People with professional degrees remain remarkably mobile in America. No longer happens in the middle, no longer happens at the bottom. And so the fruits of the recent economic gains in California are very unequally enjoyed. Poorer workers in the state are actually moving out of the state in large numbers, even as affluent professionals with postgraduate degrees are moving in. If California wants to get back to being that engine of prosperity and font of innovation, there's no better way to do that than deciding that, in fact, it can grow again.
So one of the quotes you include in the book is actually from the Biden administration, acknowledging kind of the detrimental effects that zoning ordinances and others have had over the course of years. I'm curious, maybe this is stepping more into your deputy executive editor role. We've got a different administration in the White House now, different things happening with the economy today, yesterday. How are those, the changes that you've seen coming down, whether it's tariffs, whether it's crackdown on immigration, how would you connect those threads to the concerns you raise in your book?
Yeah, so the macro picture here is that in a country where more and more people are convinced that the pie is of a fixed size and that life is a zero-sum game, you start to pursue a set of policies that try to help you win that zero-sum game. So I think that our political mood has changed, right? When we were a country full of optimists because we were always moving around, we pursued optimistic policies. We are now a country that is largely stuck and are pursuing things like tariffs, like immigration restriction, which are intended to preserve for those who are here the available spoils on the theory that there's only so much to go around, right? So that's the macro picture. The policy picture on housing is a little bit more clouded. One of those many executive orders that President Trump signed on his first day in office decried local regulation for driving up housing prices and said we needed to fix it and he's talked about repeatedly about solving America's housing crisis. The trouble is that he's also pursuing a set of policies that seem designed to inflame that crisis. There was a rule known as AFFH, which was intended to further fair housing by paring back zoning regulation in the suburbs. And Trump and his administration have taken a very dramatic stand, rolling back that regulation to enable local communities to continue to zone themselves, even where that zoning is clearly a means of racial segregation. And so I'm no longer optimistic that this is an administration that, for all of its deregulatory bluster, is particularly interested in tackling this problem. But there's a silver lining, which is that because this is a problem which is concentrated almost exclusively in blue jurisdictions, that's where the jobs are, that's where the opportunities are, that's where people want to move. It's a local issue. There is nothing to stop states and localities from solving this themselves, even without the help of the White House. In fact, it's something of a competitive state issue, where as states want to attract business and population, to the extent that they tackle this, they gain an edge. Right now, that edge is accruing mostly to red states, which are successfully luring businesses and population, and progressives under the current administration, despite the current administration, have the chance to reverse that.
So that was actually one of the questions that an audience member had, like, so who's doing it right in terms of policy? And both within the U.S. and then also if we're looking internationally for other models, like where might we learn something?
Yeah, there are jurisdictions that are moving. Many of you probably know California has made some progress on this. Most of that progress to date is performative. If you get rid of single-family zoning in favor of duplexes, you still face the economic impossibility of tearing down an existing single-family home to put up a duplex, right? Like you will not actually foster housing production this way. But there are jurisdictions that are doing more. Cambridge, Massachusetts just rezoned the entire city for building up to 6 stories multifamily housing, which was a huge deal. As one of the tech centers of the East, where there's a lot of really good jobs, it was historically a working class community, has become a professional class community, is trying to reverse that. So you can find places in the US that are making pretty dramatic moves. One of my favorite examples actually is Tokyo, which in the 70s through the 90s was on the same trajectory as New York City, right? So just at the same time that we do, they devolve a lot of control down to the local level, come up with community hearings and other consensual review processes. And housing production grinds to a halt, and rents and housing prices start soaring. But in Japan, zoning is ultimately a question. In the States, zoning is a question of state law, which can delegate these down to municipalities, but the states have the final say. In Japan, it's the federal government that has the final say. And so they rework their national zoning code because they recognize that Tokyo is a giant engine of the economy for the entire country, and that if Tokyo chokes itself off, all of Japan will suffer. And they have a set of national zoning designations, I think 12 labels that you can apply. Any municipality can apply any of these 12 labels to any neighborhood. But the most restrictive still allows for multifamily housing with street level retail. You can't go more restrictive than that anywhere in Japan. And so once they change these rules to allow so that many of the most restrictive designations just go away, housing production resumes in Tokyo. The rents come back, the rate of increase comes substantially back down, and in some areas actually falls. And you still in Tokyo have really vibrant mixed-use neighborhoods with small-scale manufacturing, local retail, lots of small businesses, things that many Americans say they miss about their cities have remained there. Particularly with local retail, one of the things I think we often miss is that if you're walking through a neighborhood that is beautifully preserved from the late 19th century, and you pass a boarded up shop, you may not recognize the connection there. That neighborhood that was built in the 19th century almost certainly houses today no more than 1/3 of the population that it held when it was constructed. We live in much more space now. We don't take in adult porters. We don't, have hired help that's living on the premises. The family size is much smaller now than it once was. For all of these reasons, if you're in an authentically preserved 19th or early 20th century neighborhood, those buildings are only housing about 1/3 as many people as they once did. And so they can't support the stores that they once supported. They don't have the kind of retail that they were originally designed to have. And so when we look at, it's easy to walk through a neighborhood and blame Amazon for the death of local retail. And of course, online commerce has a role to play in that. But the other thing that we've done is we've just hollowed out our cities by preserving the built form of the cities, but not the communities that those buildings once housed. You'd have to build up 3 times as high to have as many customers within walking distance, and we just haven't been willing to do that.
So one of the audience members here notes, I find that in my experience, people maybe even subconsciously link problems in urban governance, crime, homelessness, et cetera, with housing density. Similarly, many simply see high housing costs in dense cities and think density equals more expensive. How can we challenge these assumptions?
I love the question. It's funny in some ways in that density was originally seen as something that drove down housing prices as sort of an evil to the first half of the question. I would love to push us beyond thinking about buildings as moral determinants, right? That was the great 19th century sin, was they kept on looking at the building, people living in squalid conditions, and they're like, oh my God, they're living in such squalid conditions.
It goes against God's plan.
Yeah, there's a preacher who says, right, that the apartment goes against God's plan, right? But that attitude was always like, these conditions are terrible, let's ban the building, right? And then they move into a new housing type and they're like, my God, we still haven't solved the problem, poverty in America, let's ban that building too. And nobody sort of takes that step back and says, maybe the problem is poverty, not the actual built environment. And if we can shift our frame and say, the problem here is not that the buildings are dense, that the buildings are not dense. You've all, I think, probably walked past a high-rise development of insanely expensive apartments that is very dense and yet not very poor. Or when Charles Chaney was trying to ban apartment buildings from California, he had this very inconvenient role in the California State Housing Survey because what it actually found was that the housing conditions were worse in California than they were back on the Lower East Side. It was just all single-family homes that were just terrible places to live, right? Like they were shacks in some cases with no running water, no sanitation, no heat. The wind rattled through the boards, and so it's not the case that low density housing is necessarily wonderful. It's not the case that high density housing is necessarily terrible. What ultimately matters is that people have the opportunity to find the housing types that are going to work for them, and they've got the opportunity to go and find the job that'll help them support their families and live in some degree of comfort. And if you give people that flexibility and that agency, people are pretty smart and they'll usually figure it out on their own.
So we're at the time we just have time for one more question. You've moved 15 times?
15 times, yeah.
So if you were to pick one place that you could move next, right? Forget about work, forget about everything else.
Wow.
Where would you want to live?
See, here's this. I've moved 15 times in my life. I have never wanted to move. Moving is a pain in the neck. If I never wrapped another dish in newspaper again, I would be a happy man. It's a little like exercise. It's like getting up off the couch and like, I don't want to take a jog. I don't want to move. But I know it's good for me. And it'd be fun to come back out here. I lived in California once 20 years ago. It'd be nice to come back here someday.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Yoni Applebaum, author of Stuck, How the Privileged and Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. Thanks also to you, our audience here in San Francisco, and those of us who joined us online. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. For those of you who are here, Yoni Applebaum will be signing copies of his book Stuck in the lounge outside the auditorium shortly. Finally, Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to come back for future programs. If you're not already a member here, we'd love to have you join us. In addition to supporting our good work, you'll receive discounts on tickets, early notice of programs, travel opportunities, and more. You can sign up at the front desk or do it online and find out more at commonwealthclub.org. I'm Stephen Saum. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and take care.